I was halfway through my morning eggs when my son slid a manila folder across my kitchen table and said, as calmly as someone ordering coffee, "Dad, we need you to help us make this happen. Before we continue, please subscribe my channel for such more stories, and let us know where you are listening in the comments." The fork paused in my hand. Through the open window, Maple Ridge sounded like it always did at 8 a.m. A delivery truck downshifting by the hardware store, a mower starting somewhere up the block, sparrows arguing in the maple outside, ordinary noises that made the word need feel like a small stone dropped into a deep well. I'm Graham Whitaker, 65 next month, retired after 4 decades crawling through basements and fixing old boilers that should have been put out of their misery in the Clinton years. The house is modest, the yard straight enough for a push mower, the savings careful and boring. I've always believed in things you can hold in your hands, a wrench, a ledger, your breath on a cold morning. Promises that live only in the air make me nervous. "Go ahead and look," my son said. Mason wore the good shirt he saves for meetings, sleeves crisp, hair pushed back like in those professional headshots he posts online. Beside him, his wife scrolled on her phone, her nails a fresh glossy coral that caught the sun. "We found a place in Brookview," she said without looking up. 3 walk-in closets and a soaking tub. "It's perfect for when we start trying." I pulled the folder open. The numbers were immediate and loud, purchase price circled in blue pen, a cheerful printout with columns of payment schedules, a pre-approval letter that read like a pep talk. My name in a blank labeled co-signer. "What is it you're asking me to do?" I said, though my chest already knew. "Just add your name," Mason said, tapping the page as if I'd missed the obvious. "Your credit is spotless. With you on it, the rate drops and underwriting's a breeze." I read the monthly payment twice, then a third time, feeling my pulse thump in my ears. "That's a mortgage for $400,000, I said. "It's an investment in family," his wife Tessa answered. She finally lifted her eyes, smiling the kind of smile people wear when they've already rehearsed the outcome. "We'll handle the payments. We just need your signature to open the door." The kitchen smelled like coffee and lemon oil from the cabinet doors. I polished last week, a simple, decent smell that kept me steady. "What are you two bringing home each month?" I asked. Mason shifted. "It fluctuates. Ballpark it for me." He named a number that would cover a smaller life, an apartment with sunlight and good appliances, a used car with decent brakes, not a house that boasted about itself from the curb. "And this payment," I said, tapping the page with the back of my fingernail, "would eat half of that before we even talk lights, insurance or a roof when it leaks in February." "You're being negative," Tessa said, and the word negative landed like an accusation. "People our age build wealth through real estate. You've said that yourself." I said people build wealth by buying what they can afford and paying it off. She set her phone down, palms open as if explaining something to a slow student. "Family lifts family. Isn't that what grandparents do, Mr. Whitaker? Invest in the future." That word again, future, stretched like a banner over a battlefield I hadn't agreed to enter. I thought of my late wife Nora, how she would have looked at me right now, chin tucked, eyes asking if the thing was fair. She'd hated big shows of anything, especially money. "What exactly are you asking?" I said. "Because details matter. Because words turn into signatures, and signatures become obligations that knock at your door when you're not sleeping." "Co-sign," Mason said. "You won't have to pay. It just helps us qualify." "That's not how co-signing works," I said quietly. Silence settled between us, light through the window moving across the table, inch by inch, catching the blue veins on the back of my hand. I realized with a small private sorrow that I was seeing a version of my son I didn't recognize. When he was 10, he used to hold the flashlight while I tightened valves, elbows knocking mine, questions tumbling out so fast they tripped over each other. He liked to get it right on the first try. He liked to be good. "I'm not putting my name on $400,000, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The sentence had weight all on its own. Tessa's expression cooled so quickly. It was like someone cracked a window in January. "So that's it," she said. "You're choosing your savings account over your son's first home." I'm choosing math, I said. And boundaries. Mason's jaw worked. You've got retirement accounts you barely touch, he said, eyes sliding away from mine to the neat stack of paperwork, as if the pages might look back at him with more sympathy. You're not broke. You could help. I took a breath. Inside it I found a memory I didn't want, a different request for a smaller sum, a promise to pay me back once a bonus hit, that never did. Then a card left on my birthday with a nice note but no mention of what was owed. Little things add up. One loose tile becomes a tripping hazard if you ignore it. I've helped, I said. Plenty. Not like this. Tessa pushed her chair back and stood. The legs scraped the floor, a long dry sound. We drove across town this morning because we believed you were a decent man, she said, voice thin and bright. I see I was wrong. My son flinched at that, which hurt in a place that still remembers holding him against my chest when he was small and feverish. He gathered the papers with more force than necessary. You'll regret this, he said, looking at the folder, not me. When there's a grandbaby you barely know. The front door closed with the kind of finality people use when they want you to hear it. A minute later, I could make out their car pulling away, tires whispering on the wet blacktop. I watched the maple leaves shift in the breeze and waited for the quiet to feel like peace again. It didn't. I washed my plate and mug, dried them with a towel that still smelled faintly of detergent, and put everything where it belonged. Then I took a notebook from the drawer where coupons and batteries go to be forgotten. On the first line I wrote today's date, underlined it, and noted the time Mason and Tessa arrived, what they asked, the numbers I'd read, the words cosine, and 400,000 dark enough to indent the next page. It wasn't paranoia. It was a habit from years of service calls. What you wrote down saved you later, when a water heater that leaked on Tuesday somehow had always been like that by Friday. The phone began to ring before I finished the second page. My sister Laurel, whose voice always carries equal parts kindness and alarm. Graham. Honey, what on earth happened? Mason just called me sobbing. He says you refused to help them buy a safe home. They showed me a mortgage I can't in good conscience touch, I said. They'll be fine in a sensible place. There was a beat of silence where I could hear her deciding which side of the river to stand on. He says you've got more than you'll ever need. I have exactly enough to sleep at night. After we hung up, messages stacked like plates in a sink. A neighbor who hated to get in the middle, but felt compelled to speak truth. An old friend of Mason's accusing me of not believing in my own child. A cousin I haven't seen in 3 Thanksgivings wondering if I was feeling well lately, because Mason said I seemed confused about things. I wrote each one down. Time, name, gist. I screenshotted the texts, filed them on my desktop in a folder I named with something boring on purpose, garden plans, and felt the smallest flicker of anger steady my hands. There's a tone you recognize if you've ever been cornered by it, the note of urgency that isn't really about your well-being, the soft blade under a blanket. For your own sake, just do what we want. By noon the kitchen had lost its morning warmth. Clouds pushed in from the west. I made a second pot of coffee and stood at the sink while it dripped, thinking about how quickly pressure spreads if you let it, how people who don't pay your bills always know exactly what you should do with your money. I'm not a rich man. I'm a careful one. There's a difference you can feel when the furnace goes out and the wind leans on the side of the house all night. The phone rang again. This time it was Mason. His voice had that strained politeness that lives 1 inch above anger. Dad, listen, we're up against a deadline. If we don't secure the financing by Friday, we lose our deposit. How much did you put down? 25 grand. I closed my eyes a moment, saw the numbers like a train that's already moving too fast. If the bank won't touch it without an older man's signature, it's not the right house. A muffled sound, then Tessa came on, buttering her words like toast. Mr. Whitaker, I know this is scary for you. Big decisions are hard when you're used to routine. But this is love. It's legacy. It's what good fathers do. I'm not signing, I said, and ended the call before we could circle another lap around the same track. The afternoon stretched long, a grey sheet pulled tight over the day. I put on my jacket and walked the block to the post office, a loop I take when my back gets stiff. On the way, I passed the window of the coffee shop where the high schoolers camp with laptops, and saw a girl hold her phone toward a friend, both of them frowning, then glancing up at me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the first ripple. Maple Ridge isn't a small town so much as a place where stories travel quickly to all the places you'd prefer they didn't. When I got home there was a certified letter waiting in my mailbox, the kind with a green card you sign and hand back to the carrier while you try to read his face for clues. I set it on the table and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at a ceiling stain you're not ready to admit is a leak. Then I slit it open with a butter knife and pulled out a letterhead from a firm in Milwaukee I'd never heard of, its logo eager and expensive. Request for meeting regarding family financial obligations and support commitments. Neat paragraphs about amicable resolutions and timelines. Phrases crafted to be polite and heavy at once. The subtext was louder than the actual sentences. Come sit with us and bring your checkbook or your dignity. I folded the paper back along its creases and returned it to the envelope, my hands very steady now. I boiled water, set out a tea bag the way Nora used to when something had rattled me, and stood at the stove until the kettle sang. While it cooled, I opened the notebook again and wrote, "Call attorney, document everything." Then I added a line I underlined twice. They think I'm alone. The house was quiet in that peculiar late-day way, rooms holding their breath, the light thinning to a soft pewter. I walked to the back door and looked out over the narrow strip of lawn where the tomatoes would go in next month, if the frost cooperated. There's comfort in work, you understand. Turn the soil, water at the base, pinch the suckers early, tie the vines before they sag. Simple steps, done in order, keep a plant from falling under its own weight. I took my tea to the table, opened my laptop, and began the kind of list that has saved me more than once. Who to call, what to save, what not to say on the phone. I didn't know then where the road would bend, only that I wasn't going to be shoved down it with my eyes closed. Somewhere a neighbor's wind chimes caught a slower breeze and answered themselves, bright and patient. When the phone lit up again, I let it ring. Then I set it face down, breathed in the steam rising from the mug, and made the first calm decision of the day. If they wanted a war of pressure, they were about to meet a different kind of resistance, the quiet, stubborn kind that stacks facts like bricks and doesn't move when someone shouts. The next morning, the first ring came before sunrise. I was in the middle of pouring batter into the skillet when the phone's vibration rattled across the counter, the screen lit with my brother-in-law's name. I let it go to voicemail. Before the final buzz died, another call came. This one from a number I didn't know. Then another, and another. By the time the first pancake was on the plate, my call log looked like I'd just won a prize in a contest I never entered. I sat down at the table, coffee steaming beside me, and pressed play on the voicemails in order. "Graham, it's Pete. Mason tells me you refused to help them get a place in Brookview. Is that true? They're young, trying to get ahead. What's a signature to you?" Next message. "This is Rachel from the congregation. I don't know what's going on, but Mason said you've been difficult about a family matter. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." The tone was the same in each one, a mix of pity and disapproval, the way people talk to someone who's lost their way. Not one of them asked what had actually happened. They didn't want my side. They already had a version they liked better. By 9 o'clock, my sister Laurel called again, this time not to plead but to scold. "Graham, I just got off the phone with Tessa. She's in tears. They've got their hearts set on this house, and now they're talking about losing the deposit. Why would you stand in the way of that?" "I'm not standing in the way," I said. "I'm refusing to prop up a mortgage that could sink us all." "You have the money," she said, as if that closed the discussion. "I have enough to live the life I built, not to fund the one they dream up over brunch." Her silence was thicker this time, almost resentful, and I could picture her frowning in that way. That means she's already decided I'm wrong. By mid-morning, The messages weren't just calls. They were digital ink stains spreading across every surface of my life. Screenshots of Facebook posts started arriving from old friends who knew I didn't have an account. One from Kayla's page read, "When your own family values money over love, you find out what home really means." Beneath it, a photo of her and Mason looking worn but brave, arms around each other, with the caption, "We'll find our way without help." The comments were a parade of sympathy. Shame on him. Blood is thicker than water, unless you're cold-hearted. I clicked through the images my neighbor sent, and felt that same small stone from yesterday's kitchen drop deeper into the well. This wasn't just a disagreement now, it was a campaign. I opened my notebook and made a fresh page, titled Public Narrative. Under it, I wrote down each post, each call, each screenshot, dating and time-stamping them like I used to with service tickets. If they wanted a story war, I'd have the record. At 11, the landline rang. Only a handful of people still used it, and all of them had been in my phone book for decades. I picked up. "Graham Whitaker?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, professional. "Yes, this is Dennis from Brookview Mortgage. Your son mentioned you might be joining as a co-signer, so I wanted to walk through the details." I leaned back in my chair, watching the ceiling fan rotate above me. "I won't be co-signing, Dennis, but I'd be interested to hear the terms they were given." There was a pause, then paper rustling. "Well, I'll be honest, the loan is on the high side for their income, and with their existing obligations." "What obligations?" "Credit cards, mostly. About 47,000 combined. Car leases, student loans. The monthly debt-to-income ratio is already tight." I thanked him for his time, and ended the call, my pen already scratching down the figures. The numbers told a plainer truth than any Facebook post could. This wasn't about starting a family in comfort, it was about maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford. By lunchtime, the social frost had begun to creep outside my phone. At the grocery store, the cashier, who usually asked about my garden, scanned my items without meeting my eyes. On Main Street, I passed a couple I'd known since Mason was in Little League. They kept walking, suddenly very interested in the shop window beside them. The air felt colder than the early spring wind, and I knew the reason had nothing to do with the weather. That afternoon, the mailman knocked. "Certified delivery," he said, holding out an envelope with the return address of a Milwaukee law firm. I signed, took it inside, and slit it open with the same butter knife as yesterday. "Invitation to amicably resolve family financial obligations before legal action is considered." The polite phrasing was almost more insulting than an outright threat. I placed it beside the first letter, both of them lying on the table like unwanted guests. I didn't call Mason. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at my desk, and began organizing the growing pile of evidence into neat digital folders. Financial, communications, social media. Each screenshot, each voicemail transcription was a brick in the wall I was building between their version of events and the truth. By evening, the phone had stopped ringing. The silence felt deliberate, as if they'd decided to shift tactics. I closed the notebook, stretched my back, and looked out the window at the street lamp just flickering on. Somewhere out there, my son was telling another roomful of people his version of the story. Somewhere out there, the narrative was still spreading. But here, in my quiet little house, the record was forming, and I wasn't about to let theirs be the only one that survived. 2 days later, it was no longer just whispers and sidelong glances. It was a full-throated chorus. By breakfast, I'd received 3 more screenshots from people who thought I should be aware of what was being said about me online. Mason and Tessa's posts had grown longer, more detailed, and more manipulative, painting a picture of a poor young couple abandoned by a cold, well-off father who cared more about his bank balance than his only child's happiness. One post had a photo of the outside of a tidy brick ranch house, the one that got away, with the caption, "We could have built our future here, but sometimes family closes doors instead of opening them." Dozens of sad emojis and comments followed. "She's lucky she even had a father to ask," one woman wrote. Another, "Unbelievable. I'd give my kids the shirt off my back." They weren't talking to me, but the barbs were sharp all the same. I decided to go into town for some errands, if only to show my face. There's a difference between holding your ground and hiding, and I wasn't about to look like a man ashamed of doing the right thing. But the reception was icy. At Murphy's Hardware, where I'd bought every tool I own, Tom Murphy gave me a curt nod and rang up my light bulbs without our usual 2 minutes of small talk about fishing. At the coffee shop, the high school kid, who usually offered me my regular without asking, didn't meet my eyes. By the time I got back home, there was another certified letter waiting in the mailbox. This one was heavier, thick with multiple sheets. I opened it at the kitchen table, my hands steady in the way they always are when a job calls for precision. It was from the same Milwaukee firm. The language had shifted from polite invitation to pointed demand. A meeting is requested to discuss financial obligations and to avoid potential legal action. The words financial obligations were printed twice, each time in bold. I called my attorney, Benjamin Holt, who'd handled my will and some estate planning over the years. He's the kind of man who listens more than he talks. And when he does speak, it's like he's laying bricks, solid, deliberate, permanent. They're building a case, he said after I'd explained. Keep documenting everything. Save every post, every voicemail, every text. If this goes to court, we'll need to show a pattern of behavior, not just one bad week. That evening, I made good on his advice. I went through my notes and created a second notebook, one for chronology alone. Day, time and exact words used, both online and off. I took screenshots of Tessa's posts and stored them in a folder marked public statements, pairing them with images of their vacations and expensive dinners they'd posted just weeks earlier. For every emotional plea about barely making ends meet, I had a matching photo of Mason standing next to a rented BMW in a resort parking lot or holding champagne under a string of bistro lights. By nightfall, my case file was thick enough to feel heavy in my hands. It wasn't revenge. It was insurance. My father used to say that a man who can prove the truth is already halfway to winning. I made myself a late supper, scrambled eggs, toast and tea, and took it to the porch. Across the street, I noticed a silver SUV parked under the streetlight, idling with its lights off. I recognized it as Tessa's. She sat in the driver's seat, eyes locked on my house, phone glowing in her hand. I held her gaze for a moment through the dim glass before she started the engine and drove away without so much as a wave. The message was clear. If they couldn't push me in public, they'd try to rattle me in private. I finished my tea, washed the mug, and made one more note in my chronology, 9:42 p.m. Tessa Whitaker, observed in vehicle outside residence. No interaction. If they thought intimidation would make me yield, they'd forgotten who raised me. The next morning brought a sky the color of cold steel and a knock on the door that carried the weight of bad news. When I opened it, the mail carrier stood with a clipboard and a familiar green return receipt card. "Certified delivery again, Mr. Whitaker," he said. I signed, thanked him, and closed the door. The envelope bore the same Milwaukee law firm's logo, but this one felt heavier still, as though someone had packed it with all the air from a storm cloud. I slit it open and slid the papers onto the table. This wasn't a letter, it was a lawsuit. Whitaker vs. Whitaker. It read in the caption box, as if the words themselves were a kind of betrayal. Mason and Tessa were demanding $400,000 plus legal fees, claiming I had made repeated verbal commitments to provide financial assistance for major family purchases. The accusations were printed in neat paragraphs, each one a twist of the knife: breach of promise, emotional distress, implied contract. The most insulting line, though, was buried near the end, an insinuation that I might be suffering from age-related cognitive decline, implying I'd forgotten promises I'd made. I sat back, the paper crackling in my grip. Not only were they painting me as a miser, but now as a man too old and confused to manage his own affairs. I called Benjamin immediately. "They've filed," I said. "Bring it in." "Today," he replied without hesitation. An hour later, I was sitting in his office, across from a spread of papers that looked like a blueprint for dishonor. Benjamin read each page slowly, his brow tightening by degrees. They're throwing every tactic at you, he said. Breach of oral contract, promissory estoppel, even laying the groundwork for a guardianship petition, if they can make the cognitive decline claim stick. I stared out his window at the courthouse, across the square. They're trying to take my retirement, Ben. All of it. And they think you'll settle to avoid the embarrassment, he said. Most people do, but you've been documenting everything. I slid my notebook across the desk. The first section held every text and voicemail from the last week. The second outlined Tessa's social media posts, with dates, times, and corresponding evidence of their spending. The third was a running log of every phone call from friends, family, and neighbors, repeating the same carefully planted story. Benjamin flipped through it, nodding. This is gold. We'll file a response denying all claims, along with counterclaims for defamation, harassment, and abuse of process. We'll also request full discovery, every financial record, every social media account, every witness they claim supports their case. I leaned forward. I want all of it public. If they want to put my name in the mud, they can watch theirs dragged right next to it, with the truth attached. His mouth curved into the kind of smile lawyers give when they see the win ahead. Then that's exactly what we'll do. By the time I left his office, the gray sky had shifted to a sharper blue. The courthouse bell struck noon as I walked across the square, the sound ringing clean in the cold air. I passed familiar faces on the sidewalk, some avoiding my eyes, others giving the kind of polite nod that hides curiosity. Let them wonder, I thought. The story they've been fed is about to get new chapters. Back home, I pulled my case file from the drawer and began sorting the most damning pieces into a trial binder. Tessa's vacation photos, paired with her poverty pleas. Mason's boast about his gaming setup, time-stamped a week before a claim of barely making rent. The recorded call where he admitted, "We never thought you'd fight the lawsuit. Our lawyer said most people your age just settle." Each page I slid into a sleeve was another stone in the wall I was building between me and their lies. And for the first time since that morning at the kitchen table, I felt something steady and unshakable rising in me. They'd fired the first shot. Now they'd see how it felt when someone stood his ground. 2 days after Benjamin filed our response and counterclaims, I decided to stop letting Mason and Tessa's version of events drift unchecked through town. I've lived here my whole life, fixed enough pipes, furnaces, and sump pumps to know just about everyone by name. And I wasn't about to let years of trust be eaten away by a lie, repeated often enough to stick. My first stop was Murphy's Hardware. Tom was behind the counter, his usual easy smile replaced by a guarded expression. I set a folder on the counter, flipping it open just enough for him to see the top page, a screenshot of Tessa's Facebook post about barely making rent, dated 3 weeks before a photo of her holding a flute of champagne at a Miami rooftop bar. "Thought you might want the whole story," I said quietly. He studied the photos, then glanced at me. "So they're telling people I'm letting them drown. Truth is, they've been buying boats with holes in them." By the time I left, his handshake was firm again. Next, I walked to St. Luke's, where Father Jensen was sorting hymnals in the front pews. "Mind if I show you something?" I asked. We sat in a patch of light spilling through the stained glass, my binder open between us. I showed him the travel photos, the receipts, the text where Tessa admitted the pregnancy scare had been a false alarm, because stress makes me late sometimes. He exhaled slowly, closing the binder. "I misjudged," he said. "I should have come to you first." That was the refrain I started hearing as I made my way through the places that had grown cold in recent weeks. At the library, Helen, the head librarian, looked at the side-by-side printouts I'd brought. Tessa's post about being heartbroken, followed by Mason's new $3,000 gaming rig, and shook her head. "I've been avoiding you," she admitted. "I'm sorry for that. It wasn't about humiliating them. It was about pulling the wool from the eyes of the people they'd wrapped in a false narrative." The more I shared, calmly and without embellishment, the more I saw doubt take root where certainty had been. Word spreads differently in a place like this, when the current changes. The next morning at the diner, Sarah the waitress approached with a steaming mug before I even sat down. "On the house," she said, "and I owe you an apology. I saw those Facebook posts, thought the worst. She glanced around, lowered her voice. But half the town's seen the Vegas photos now. People are starting to talk. I sipped my coffee and let her words settle. This wasn't a wave yet, but it was a ripple, and ripples had a way of building if the wind held. That afternoon, Mrs. Chen stopped me at my mailbox, holding a casserole dish like a peace offering. "I've been thinking," she said. "Mason drives a nicer car than my husband, and we're both still working. How exactly are they struggling?" "That's a good question," I said, "and one they won't want to answer honestly." By the end of the week, the temperature of the room had shifted. The same neighbors who'd crossed the street to avoid me now nodded in greeting. At the grocery store, the cashier met my eyes again. The story Mason and Tessa had so carefully staged was beginning to collapse under the weight of proof, and I wasn't finished stacking it. It didn't take long for the shift in town to reach Mason and Tessa. I could see it in the way their social media posts started to change. Less confidence, more pleading. The carefully curated victim narrative was now peppered with defensive replies to comments like, "Weren't you just in Vegas last month?" Or "That's a nice BMW for someone who can't make rent." A week earlier, those comments would have been drowned in a tide of sympathy. Now they sat there like stains you couldn't scrub out. Benjamin called one afternoon to tell me they'd hired a different attorney. "Looks like they've replaced the first one," he said. "The new counsel filed a motion to delay discovery, probably because your counterclaims require them to turn over their financial records." "Stalling," I said. "Stalling," he agreed, "and likely scrambling to figure out how to explain the spending without admitting to misrepresentation." That same evening, I saw Mason for the first time in weeks. I was leaving the diner when he stepped out from around the corner, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He didn't look like the man who had walked into my kitchen full of certainty. His eyes were ringed with fatigue, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Dad, can we talk?" he said. I studied him for a moment. "Here, or somewhere else?" "Somewhere else. Just us." We ended up at a park bench in Riverside Green, the same place I'd taught him to ride his bike when he was 7. Back then, he'd fallen twice before finding his balance. I'd told him to keep looking where he wanted to go, not at the ground. Now, he was staring at the ground. "This lawsuit, it's gotten out of hand," he began. "The legal bills are a lot, and people are saying things online that—" He stopped, exhaled sharply. "Look, maybe if you can help us with part of the down payment, we can drop all this. We don't need the whole house. Just something to get started." It was the same tactic I'd seen 100 times in other jobs. Start high, get refused, then make a smaller offer that suddenly sounds reasonable by comparison. But the numbers had never been the point. I pulled out my phone and, without hiding it, hit record. "Tell me exactly what you want." He hesitated, then admitted they were behind on the BMW lease, owed $47,000 in credit card debt, and had borrowed money from half a dozen people in the last year. "We thought you'd just settle," he said. "Our first lawyer told us most people your age would rather pay than deal with the stress." I let the silence stretch before I said, "Your lawyer was wrong." He looked up at me then, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who used to hold the flashlight steady while I tightened bolts. But that boy was buried under years of choices I hadn't made for him. "I can't undo what's already been set in motion," I said finally. "You brought this into a courtroom. That's where it'll end." When we stood, there was no handshake, no pat on the shoulder, just two men walking in opposite directions, the air between us heavier than it had been that morning. I went home and added the recording to my evidence file. Another brick in the wall, another crack in theirs. Benjamin's office smelled faintly of old leather and fresh coffee. When I walked in the next morning, a USB drive in my pocket, holding the recording from the park. He was already seated at the long conference table, files spread neatly in front of him. "Did he know you were recording?" Benjamin asked once I'd handed it over. "Yes, I told him it was for my protection." He smiled faintly. "Good. In this state, that's all we need. This," he said, tapping the USB, "is going to be very useful." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing the growing case file. The social media posts paired with evidence of their spending. The text messages alternating between guilt trips and outright threats. The mortgage application with the inflated numbers. And now the recorded admission that their lawyer had assumed I'd pay to avoid the stress. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. They've given us everything we need to dismantle their credibility. The next step is to prepare for deposition. I want them on record, under oath, trying to explain the gap between their claims and the reality of their finances. What about the delay they requested? I asked. The judge denied it yesterday. Discovery moves forward. They'll have to hand over their bank statements, credit card bills, lease agreements, everything. I left his office feeling something I hadn't since the whole mess began. Momentum. That afternoon, I made the decision to show a little more of my hand to the community. I wasn't broadcasting the details, but I wanted the truth to keep trickling out. At the diner, when Sarah asked how things were going, I told her, it's all public record now. Every dollar they've spent, every vacation, every car payment. Folks can draw their own conclusions. By the end of the day, I'd run into 3 people who'd clearly heard a new version of the story. Didn't realize you had all that proof, Tom Murphy said when I stopped by the hardware store. Changes things. But not everyone was swayed yet. That evening, as I was sorting receipts at the kitchen table, I got a text from Laurel. They're saying you're going to bankrupt them out of spite. Is that true? No, I replied. I'm going to hold them accountable for lying in a courtroom. There's a difference. A few minutes later, another text came in. This one from Tessa. You won't win. We'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. I stared at the message for a moment before screenshotting it, adding it to my evidence folder under direct threats. The threat didn't rattle me. It told me exactly what I already knew, that the cracks were widening and they were feeling the pressure. Late that night, I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of tea. The street was quiet, but halfway down the block, I noticed the silver SUV again, idling under the same streetlight as before. This time I took out my phone and snapped a photo. The flash caught the windshield, and a moment later, the SUV pulled away. They could circle my street all they wanted. The courthouse conference room was colder than it needed to be, the kind of chill that settles in your shoulders, no matter how you sit. I arrived early with Benjamin, our binders lined in neat stacks. Across the table, the chairs for Mason and Tessa were still empty. I wondered if they'd stroll in late to make a point, or show up early to assert confidence. They arrived right on time, dressed for the part they'd been trying to play for months. Mason in a tailored navy suit, Tessa in a black dress and pearls that whispered serious, but screamed expensive. Their new attorney, a younger man with slicked back hair and a smug expression, made a point of not looking at me when he shook Benjamin's hand. The court reporter sat up at the head of the table, her fingers poised over the stenograph machine. Once the recorder was switched on, there was no turning back. Benjamin started with simple questions for Mason. State your full name for the record, Mason Whitaker, and your occupation, IT consultant. It was routine until Benjamin slid a page across the table, a printout from Mason's own public social media account, showing him holding a drink in Las Vegas. Mr. Whitaker, can you confirm this photo was taken 3 weeks before you claimed in a sworn statement that you were unable to afford basic living expenses? Mason shifted in his seat. That trip was already paid for. With what funds? Credit. And your credit card balances at that time? Benjamin's tone was calm, almost polite, as he slid over another document. Mason's credit report from that month, showing $47,000 in combined debt. The room was silent except for the tap of the court reporter's keys. When it was Tessa's turn, Benjamin began the same way, soft questions that seemed harmless until he dropped a receipt on the table. This invoice from a boutique in Chicago is for $1,250, dated 2 days after you posted online that you were struggling to pay rent. Can you explain that? Her attorney objected to tone, but the question stood. That was a gift, Tessa said. Purchased on your personal credit card, Benjamin replied, flipping to the statement with her signature in neat cursive. Piece by piece, he dismantled the image they'd tried to present. The court reporter kept her head down, but I caught the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth during some of the more absurd explanations. Then came the part Benjamin and I had been waiting for. He pulled out the transcript of my recorded conversation with Mason in the park. Mr. Whitaker, you told your father, and I quote, "Our first lawyer said most people your age just settle rather than deal with the stress. Do you deny saying this? Mason froze, his eyes darting to his attorney. The younger man muttered something about context, but the damage was already done. The words were on the record now, stripped of spin. By the time the depositions ended, the confident posture they'd walked in with had dissolved. Mason's tie was loosened, Tessa's shoulders tight. Their attorney gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eye contact. Outside in the hallway, Benjamin closed his binder with a quiet snap. They know they're cornered now, he said, and we've only just begun. As we stepped into the sunlight, I felt it too, that subtle shift when you realize the momentum is yours. For months, they'd been writing the story. Today we'd started editing it. By the weekend, word had already leaked about the depositions. In a town like ours, you don't need an official transcript, just one person in the right hallway at the right time. I didn't know who had shared the details first, but I could guess. Court reporters have friends. So do clerks, and people love a story with a turn. At the diner Saturday morning, Sarah set my coffee down and lingered a moment. Heard Mason didn't do so well the other day, she said, almost cautiously. Folks saying he didn't have answers for some things. I gave her a small nod. That's one way to put it. By the time I left, 2 other regulars had stopped me on the way out to say they were glad the truth was coming out. It was a start. That afternoon, I ran into Tom Murphy outside his store. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I'll admit, Graham, I was in their corner at first, he said, but hearing they were swiping cards for Vegas and boutiques, while crying poor, makes a man rethink his position. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was opinion shifting in real time. Then came the church service on Sunday. I sat in my usual pew, same as always, but I could feel eyes on me from across the aisle. After the benediction, Father Jensen approached, his voice low. I've been reflecting on our last conversation. I think I owe you an apology. You don't, I said. But I'll take it anyway. He nodded, then glanced toward the back where Mason's old friends from the softball league were standing. You might be interested to know, he said quietly, that not everyone's buying their story anymore. The shift wasn't just about the facts, it was about the way those facts lined up with what people had already started to notice. A BMW in the driveway, designer handbags at church, yet constant talk of being strapped. The contradictions had been there all along. They just needed a little light to be seen. Monday morning, Benjamin called. You're not going to believe this. They've taken down half their social media posts. Cleaning house, I said. Or trying to. But it's too late. We already have everything saved. That afternoon, I was in the grocery store when Laurel appeared at the end of the aisle. Her expression was tight, but she didn't look angry, more unsettled. I've been hearing things, she said. About the deposition, about the spending. They're true, I told her. Every word. She hesitated, then nodded. I think I let myself get caught up in the version they wanted me to see. I'm sorry, Graham. It was the first apology from family since the whole mess began. I didn't expect it to be the last. By the end of the week, Mason and Tessa's once solid wall of supporters had more cracks than plaster. People who'd once reposted their sad updates were now quietly removing them from their feeds. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings no longer seemed to find their way to them. The isolation they'd tried to create for me was circling back on them, and we still hadn't even stepped into the courtroom. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and something older, dust maybe, or the weight of all the grudges that had passed through its doors. I arrived with Benjamin half an hour early, dressed in the same charcoal suit I'd worn to Mason's college graduation. Across the hall they were already there, Mason in a dark blue suit, Tessa in a fitted dress, both wearing expressions that aimed for composure but didn't quite land. Their attorney, the slick-haired replacement, stood with them, shuffling papers like a man trying to look busier than he felt. When our eyes met, he looked away first. That told me something. Inside, the judge, Patricia Henley, a woman with a reputation for cutting straight to the marrow, called the room to order. Mason's attorney stood first, delivering a speech heavy with sentiment about family bonds and reasonable expectations, painting me as a father who had dangled promises and then snatched them away. He gestured toward Mason and Tessa, who sat with their hands clasped in a tableau of shared suffering. My clients only want what they were led to believe would be theirs, a modest opportunity to secure a home and build their future. Benjamin didn't interrupt. He just sat there, patient as a stone, letting them empty the well. When it was my turn, he called me to the stand. I walked up with my binder under my arm, the weight of months of careful documentation. Benjamin began gently, asking about my background, my years of work, my retirement. Then he slid the first exhibit across, screenshots of Tessa's posts about being on the edge, financially, side by side, with photos of luxury vacations, designer shopping bags, and the BMW parked outside their townhouse. "Whitaker," Benjamin said, "were you aware of these purchases at the time they were claiming hardship?" "Yes." "And did you ever promise, verbally or otherwise, to provide $400,000 for the purchase of a home?" One by one, he brought out the rest, the mortgage application, showing inflated numbers, the bank records from Discovery, the boutique receipt, dated just days after a post about being unable to afford groceries. Then came the recordings. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the click of the playback starting. Mason's voice filled the air. "Our first lawyer said most people your age just settle rather than deal with the stress." The judge's brow tightened. Benjamin finished by holding up the thick folder we'd built together. "Your Honor, every claim of poverty has been contradicted by their own words and financial records. This case is not about broken promises, it's about manipulation." When the judge finally spoke, her voice was flat but carried weight. "I've reviewed the evidence, and it paints a clear picture. The plaintiffs have failed to provide credible proof of any promise, written or verbal, and have in fact presented a pattern of deceptive behavior." She looked directly at Mason and Tessa. "This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the defendants' counterclaims for defamation, harassment, and abuse of process are granted in full." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. Benjamin leaned toward me, his voice low. "That's a clean sweep, Graham." I didn't look at Mason and Tessa as I stepped down from the stand. I didn't need to. The air around them was heavy with something I recognized from years of fixing leaks. Once the seal breaks, the pressure drops fast, and all that's left is the slow drip of consequences. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was high, and the air carried that clean, early spring sharpness. A small knot of people had gathered near the steps. Some reporters from the local paper, a few curious faces from town, and even a couple of my old customers from my plumbing days. "Mr. Whitaker, how do you feel about the verdict?" one of the reporters called out. I thought about it for a moment. "Relieved," I said, "and glad the truth was heard in full. Family should be built on respect, not leverage." It wasn't a speech, but it was enough. The reporter scribbled, others nodded, and the knot began to disperse. As I made my way toward my truck, I caught sight of Mason and Tessa moving quickly in the opposite direction, heads down, their attorney trailing behind. Tessa's heels clicked sharply against the concrete, the sound fading as they reached the street. By the time I got home, the verdict had already started making the rounds. My phone lit up with messages, some from neighbors who'd believed me all along, others from people who admitted they'd been wrong. Tom Murphy sent a short text, "Coffee's on me tomorrow. You earned it." That evening, Mrs. Chen stopped by with a casserole and a look in her eyes that said more than the words she spoke. "I'm glad it's over," she said. "I was foolish to believe their story. People believe what's repeated often enough." I told her, but truth has its own way of sticking around. Over the next week, the ripple of consequences for Mason and Tessa grew louder. The BMW disappeared from their driveway, repossession, according to someone who lived 2 streets over. The house they'd been after never came back on the market for them. Word spread that the legal fees and the damages awarded had drained what little cushion they had. At the diner, Sarah leaned over my table. "You know, they used to come in here all the time. Haven't seen them in weeks. People remember how they treated you." The social exile was quick and thorough. Those who had rallied around their posts were now keeping their distance, not wanting to be associated with the fallout. And from what Benjamin told me, there might still be more trouble for them. perjury wasn't something Judge Henley brushed off lightly. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, I saw a moving truck roll slowly down their street. It stopped in front of their place, and I watched for a long moment as boxes were carried out, one after another, disappearing into the truck's open belly. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel pity, either. Just a quiet certainty that I had done exactly what needed to be done. Some fights you win by standing your ground. Others you win by proving, piece by piece, that the truth doesn't scare you. And this one, I'd won both ways. 3 months after the verdict, the air in Maple Ridge felt different. I could walk into the diner without sensing the weight of half the room's eyes on me. At the hardware store, Tom would ask about my garden before ringing up my purchases. Neighbors waved from their porches again. The quiet that had felt like exile now carried the ease of belonging. The file that had once sat open on my desk, my thick binder of evidence, was now tucked away in the back of my filing cabinet. I kept it not out of spite, but as a reminder that preparation and patience can outlast manipulation. Benjamin called one afternoon with an update. "Perjury charges aren't moving forward," he said, "but their record in civil court is going to follow them. Landlords, lenders, it's going to be a very long shadow." I thanked him and hung up, looking out the kitchen window at the rows of tomato plants. I'd started weeks earlier. Gardening has always been a steadying thing for me. You prepare the soil, you plant, you water, and you trust the work you've done to show when the season turns. Mason and I haven't spoken since the day in court. I've seen him once, in passing, driving an older sedan with boxes piled in the back seat. He didn't see me, or maybe he did, and chose to keep his eyes forward. Either way, I didn't wave. The silver SUV that used to idle on my street hasn't been back. Tessa's social media accounts are gone. Their names come up now and again in a hushed tone at the diner, or as a cautionary tale in conversations about money and family. But mostly, they've faded from the daily hum of this place. What hasn't faded is the respect of the people who saw the truth play out in the open. At church one Sunday, Father Jensen shook my hand and said, "You stood your ground, Graham. That's worth more than any check you could have written." He was right. This fight had never really been about money. It was about refusing to be cornered by guilt or fear, about protecting what I'd built from those who thought they were entitled to it. One evening, as the sun slid low and turned the edges of the garden gold, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and let the quiet settle around me. The worst of it was behind me now. The house was mine, the peace was mine, and the truth was mine. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's living well in the aftermath, knowing you didn't let someone else write your ending. For anyone listening, I'll tell you this: guard what you've earned, know where your boundaries are, and never be afraid to defend them. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from.